They mocked her life in a remote cabin until they learned who really owned the land. "You're a trespasser in a graveyard, sweetheart," Vitold Gonzalez sneered, his pristine Lucchese boots kicking a spray of red Colorado dirt against Veronika's porch. "This shack is an eyesore. Take the 10,000 and vanish before the bulldozers do it for free." Veronika Gradenigo didn't flinch. She tightened her grip on the scarred walnut stock of her grandfather's Winchester. "You're standing on blood and bone, Vitold. Leave." Cecilia Agulo laughed, a high, brittle sound. "Look at her, Caxpa. She actually thinks she has a choice." Frost clung to the high ridges of the San Juan Mountains, sending a biting draft down through the Uncompahgre pines and straight onto Veronika Gradenigo's front steps. She sat motionless on the warped floorboards, enveloped in a faded canvas coat that had seen better decades. Her homestead, hidden away in a rugged basin just beyond Telluride's sprawling wealth, looked less like a house and more like a natural outcropping of the Colorado bedrock. The hand-hewn timbers were bleached gray by a century of relentless sun, while the corrugated roof bore the rust-colored scars of countless blizzards. Outsiders might view the sagging structure as a blight to be scrubbed away, but for Veronika, every weathered beam pulsed with the lifeblood of her ancestors. The silence of the valley was violently shattered by the throaty roar of a black Cadillac Escalade, its tires churning the rutted, muddy access road into a slurry of gravel and alpine dirt. The massive SUV came to an aggressive halt inches from her rusted wire fence. The doors opened, and the invaders stepped out, bringing the foul stench of expensive cologne and boundless entitlement into the pure mountain air. Vitold Gonzalez led the charge. He was a man who wore his wealth like a weapon, dressed in pristine, custom-made Lucchese cowboy boots that had never touched manure, and a silver belly Stetson that looked entirely too clean. Beside him was Cecilia Agulo, a Denver socialite and real estate investor whose face was a mask of calculated perfection and deep-seated cruelty. She wore a tailored cashmere coat that cost more than Veronika made in a year of selling handcrafted furniture. Bringing up the rear was Caxpa Behrens, a hulking, silent man whose thick neck and dead eyes clearly advertised his role as Vitold's muscle. "God, the smell of this place," Cecilia muttered, pressing a manicured hand to her nose as she surveyed the modest chicken coop and the stack of hand-split firewood. "It's like stepping back into the dark ages." "How does anyone live like this?" Vitold offered a shark-like smile, stepping over the threshold of Veronika's property line without a shred of hesitation. "They won't be living like this for long, Cecilia. We're doing the county a favor." He turned his dark, predatory eyes on Veronika, who had remained perfectly still, her hands resting on her knees. "Miss Gradenigo, I see you ignored my letters, and my phone calls, and the eviction notice tacked to the post down at the county highway. Those letters," Veronika said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of the mountains, "were addressed to a squatter. I am not a squatter, Mr. Gonzalez, and this land is not for sale." Vitold chuckled, a sound entirely devoid of warmth. "Everyone has a price, Veronika. Look around you. Your roof is caving in. Your truck is held together by rust and prayers. We are offering you a generous relocation fee. $50,000. That's enough to get you a nice, warm trailer down in Montrose. You can leave this squalor behind." "You want to build a glass and steel monstrosity on Black Bear Ridge," Veronika replied, her eyes narrowing. "A playground for people who don't know the difference between a spruce and a fir." Cecilia scoffed, stepping forward, her heels sinking slightly into the dirt. "We are bringing civilization, you ignorant hermit. A 5-star eco-resort, jobs, tax revenue. You're standing in the way of progress, because you're too stubborn to admit you've failed at life. Look at yourself. You're pathetic. Katzber cracked his knuckles, a deliberate, echoing sound in the cold air. Boss says leave. You should listen to the boss. Veronika slowly stood up. She wasn't a large woman, but her presence was immense, grounded by generations of hard labor and quiet endurance. She reached behind the doorframe and pulled out her grandfather's Winchester model 1894 rifle, not aiming it, but holding it with the casual familiarity of a veteran. You have exactly 3 seconds to get off my porch, Vitold, before I start viewing you as predators harassing my livestock. Vitold's smile vanished, replaced by a sneer of pure venom. You're playing a dangerous game, trash. I have the county in my pocket. I'll see you dragged out of here in handcuffs. He spun on his heel. Come on, Cecilia. Let the rat freeze in her cage a little longer. As the escalade sped away, spraying mud over her mailbox, Veronika stroked the cold steel of the rifle barrel. They thought they were dealing with a helpless, impoverished woman. They had no idea about the storm they were trying to bottle. The next morning, Veronika drove her battered Ford F250 down the winding switchbacks into the nearest town, a rapidly gentrifying enclave where old mining history was being systematically erased by boutique coffee shops and artisan ski boutiques. She parked outside the San Miguel County Assessor's office, the cold wind whipping her dark, grey-streaked hair across her weathered face. She needed to understand how Vitold Gonzalez was moving so fast, bypassing environmental reviews and historical preservation laws that usually took years to navigate. Inside the overly heated municipal building, she found Gunnel Sutiu, the county zoning commissioner. Gunnel was a nervous, sweating man whose moral compass was entirely dictated by his bank account. He sat behind a large mahogany desk, desperately trying to avoid Veronika's piercing gaze as she stood before him. "Miss Gradenigo," Gunnel stammered, shuffling a stack of glossy architectural renderings of Vitold's proposed resort. "I didn't expect you to come down from the mountain." "I received another notice, Gunnel," Veronika said softly, dropping a crumpled piece of official county stationery onto his desk. "Eminent domain? Condemnation of property due to blight? We both know this is entirely illegal. My taxes are paid. My well is certified." Gunnel swallowed hard, adjusting his tightly knotted tie. "Veronika, look, the county council had a closed-door session. Gonzalez's firm, Apex Development, is promising a multi-million-dollar infrastructure injection. They are rezoning the Black Bear Ridge sector for commercial hospitality. Your cabin? It's considered an unsafe structure under the new district codes. It's blight. It's a historical homestead," she corrected him, leaning over the desk until Gunnel shrank back. "And you and I both know Vitold slipped you a fat envelope to expedite those zoning changes. You're selling out the valley's soul for a new swimming pool, Gunnel." "That is a baseless accusation," Gunnel flared, his face turning a blotchy red. "You are holding up progress. You own a half-acre dirt patch, Veronika. Gonzalez has secured the surrounding 3,000 acres of BLM leases and private tracts. You are an island in his ocean. Take the money and run, before the sheriff comes to physically remove you for code violations." Veronika didn't yell. She didn't argue. She simply looked at Gunnel with a pity so profound it made the corrupt commissioner flinch. "You should have checked the original deeds, Gunnel. Not just the digital copies from 1980. You should have gone down to the basement." She turned and walked out, leaving Gunnel staring anxiously at his closed office door. Her next stop was off the main strip, down a narrow alley behind a fly fishing shop, where a faded brass plaque read, "Anselmo Higgins, attorney at law." The office smelled of old paper, pipe tobacco, and peppermint. Anselmo was in his late 70s, his face a map of deep wrinkles, his eyes sharp and bright beneath bushy white eyebrows. He was poring over a massive, leather-bound ledger as she entered. "Veronika," Anselmo smiled warmly, closing the book. "I saw the escalate tearing up the mountain yesterday. I assume the vultures have finally decided to circle?" "They're moving in, Anselmo," she sighed, taking a seat in a worn leather armchair. "Gunnel Suciu is fabricating code violations to force a condemnation. Vitold wants to start clearing the tree line by next week. He had Catsper threatened me." Anselmo's eyes darkened, his jaw setting into a hard line. "Gonzales is a fool playing with dynamite." He looked at the tax maps and saw a poor woman on a tiny plot of land. He didn't bother to research the Gradenigo name. He doesn't know about the 1892 Spanish land grant, does he? "No," Veronika said, a sad, distant look in her eyes. "My father kept it quiet. My grandfather kept it quiet. We never wanted the attention, the taxes, or the greed that comes with letting the world know you hold the master deed to the entire valley." Anselmo stood, walking over to a heavy iron safe in the corner of his office. He spun the dial with practiced precision. "Your grandfather leased the surface rights to the lumber companies for pennies, just to keep the peace. But the Gradenigo Trust owns the mineral rights, the foundational land patents, and most importantly, Veronika." Anselmo pulled out a thick, yellowed sheaf of documents, sealed with heavy red wax. "The senior water rights to the entire San Miguel River tributary system. Without your explicit, signed permission, Vitold Gonzales cannot legally draw a single drop of water for his luxury hotel. Furthermore, the single-access road he's staging his equipment on? It's a private easement. Your private easement. He's mortgaged to the hilt, Anselmo," Veronika murmured. "Cecilia Agulo has been bragging in Denver about how they leverage their entire portfolio to buy the surrounding tracts. They think they've boxed me in." "When, in reality," Anselmo chuckled darkly, "they have walked right into your prison, locked the door, and handed you the key. When do you want to drop the hammer?" Veronika thought of the mocking laughter, the disdain in Cecilia's eyes, the threat of violence from Catsper. She thought of her grandfather's calloused hands building the cabin. Let them dig their grave a little deeper. Let them bring the heavy machinery. Let them think they've won. Then we take it all. By the following Tuesday, the quiet of the mountain was entirely shattered. The deep, guttural growl of Caterpillar D9 bulldozers and heavy excavators echoed through the valley like the roaring of mechanical beasts. Vitold Gonzales had moved his fleet of yellow iron to the absolute edge of Veronika's property line, their massive steel treads tearing up the delicate alpine meadows, ripping ancient root systems from the earth. The air, once fragrant with pine and damp soil, now reeked of diesel exhaust and pulverized rock. Veronika stood by her window, a mug of black coffee trembling slightly in her hands from the sheer vibrational force of the machinery outside. She watched as a massive ponderosa pine, one she had climbed as a child, its bark scarred with her childhood initials, trembled under the assault of a backhoe. A flock of Stella's jays scattered into the grey sky, screeching in distress as the ancient tree cracked, splintered, and fell with an earth-shaking thud that rattled the porcelain plates in Veronika's cupboards. The psychological warfare had begun in earnest. The operators ran their machines from dawn until dusk, their backup alarms blaring incessantly, a calculated auditory assault designed to break her spirit and drive her off the mountain. The suffocating pressure forced Veronika out of the cabin later that afternoon. She drove her battered F250 into town for supplies, needing to restock her pantry before the first major snowstorm hit, but also desperate for an hour of quiet. Yet, as she descended the switchbacks, the intrusion followed her. Bright neon, apex development, future site of Pinnacle Resort signs had been hammered into the roadside shoulders like conquering flags. Inside the local grocery store, the atmosphere was tense. Townspeople who usually greeted her with warm smiles now averted their eyes, fearful of getting caught in the crossfire of Witold's wealth. As she walked down the baking aisle, a heavy bag of flour resting on her hip, she found her path deliberately blocked by a shopping cart. Cecilia Agulo stood behind it, dressed in pristine white ski wear, looking entirely out of place among the canned beans and work boots. "Stocking up for the apocalypse, Veronika?" Cecilia sneered, her eyes raking over Veronika's worn jeans and scuffed boots with undisguised disgust. She picked up a jar of artisan preserves, examined it, and tossed it back onto the shelf. "You look exhausted. I suppose sleeping next to a construction site takes its toll. Or maybe it's just the stress of fighting a war you've already lost. The noise doesn't bother me nearly as much as the ignorance behind it," Veronika replied calmly, attempting to step around the woman. Cecilia aggressively sidestepped, shoving her cart forward to pin Veronika against the shelving unit. "You're really going to play the martyr until the bitter end, aren't you? Witold is going to bulldoze that rotted woodpile you call a home with you inside it if you don't sign the quitclaim. We own the town council. We own the sheriff. Nobody cares about an unwashed hermit holding on to a patch of dirt. You have zero leverage." "You care, Cecilia. Otherwise, you wouldn't be standing in front of me trying to bully me into giving it to you," Veronika said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, steady whisper. "And as for leverage, you might find the ground beneath your feet isn't as solid as your bank accounts." Before Cecilia could spit out a retort, Catsper appeared at the end of the aisle. The massive, brooding enforcer didn't say a word. He just stood there, cracking his knuckles, his dead, predatory focus locked onto Veronika. He kicked a fallen can of soup out of his way, letting the metallic clatter echo through the quiet store. It was a clear intimidation tactic, a silent promise of violence designed to make her feel isolated and hunted. Veronika held his gaze for a long moment, refusing to shrink before pushing past Cecilia's cart and walking to the checkout. That night, the harassment escalated from noise to outright malice. Veronika awoke at 2 a.m. to the frantic, aggressive barking of her rescue dog, a shepherd mix named Boomer. His hackles were raised, his claws scrabbling against the front door. Veronika threw on her heavy canvas coat, grabbed a heavy maglite flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch into a freezing wind that cut right to the bone. In the pitch darkness, she swept the powerful beam across her property. The fence surrounding her small vegetable garden, the same fence she had meticulously repaired every spring for 20 years, had been violently torn down, the thick cedar posts snapped like brittle twigs. Deep, muddy tire tracks from a heavy dual-axle truck tore right through her carefully cultivated winter squash and root cellar access, churning the frozen topsoil into an unrecognizable muddy trench. She walked over to the destruction, the icy wind biting at her cheeks. Her heart pounded with a mixture of profound grief and a terrifying, white-hot rage. This wasn't just property damage. It was a desecration of her sanctuary, a violation of the very soil her parents had bled to cultivate. She traced the deep tire tracks to the absolute edge of the property line, where they met the main staging area for Witold's machinery. As she stood there, her breath pluming in the freezing air, the flashlight beam caught a reflection. A heavy-duty pickup truck sat idling in the dark. Leaning against its grille was the unmistakable silhouette of Catsper. A lit cigarette glowed like a red demon eye in the dark, illuminating his smirk. He didn't run, he didn't hide, he just stood there, taking a long drag, letting her know he had done it, and daring her to do something about it. Veronika didn't shout into the wind. She didn't cry. The tears had been burned out of her years ago, when she buried her parents in the small family plot behind the cabin. Instead, a cold, absolute resolve settled over her, chilling her blood more thoroughly than the mountain air. She walked back inside the cabin, locked the heavy deadbolt, and stoked the dying embers in her wood stove. Reaching up to the mantel, she took down her grandfather's Winchester. She sat in the dark, the firelight dancing across the scarred steel barrel, and methodically loaded it, the mechanical clack-clack of the lever action, the only sound in the room. She didn't sleep. She just waited for the dawn. The time for patience had passed. The time for the reckoning had arrived. The sky over the San Juans was the color of bruised iron the next morning, heavy with the promise of a brutal winter storm. The temperature had plummeted, turning the mud to concrete. Veronika stood precisely on the eastern boundary of her land, marked by a line of ancient, moss-covered river stones her great-grandfather had laid down a century ago. She wore her heavy duster, her Stetson pulled low, the Winchester resting casually, but deliberately, in the crook of her arm. Down the access road, a massive convoy was approaching. Witold's black Escalade led the way, followed by a flatbed carrying a massive trenching machine, and Katzber's heavy-duty Ford F350. They were coming to cut the main waterline trench right across her access road, a move that would legally and physically block her into her property, forcing the county's hand to declare the cabin uninhabitable. The Escalade braked hard, fishtailing slightly in the frozen dirt. Witold jumped out, his face red with rage and the biting cold. Katzber followed, carrying a heavy steel pry bar, his eyes fixed on Veronika's rifle. "Are you insane?" Witold screamed over the idling engines of the heavy machinery. "Put the gun down, you crazy old bat. I have the county sheriff on speed dial. You pull a weapon on me, and you'll die in a federal penitentiary." "You are trespassing on a private easement, Witold." Veronika's voice cut through the noise, clear and sharp as a cracking glacier. "Turn your machines around. If that trencher crosses the stone line, I will consider it a hostile threat to my life and property, and under Colorado law, I will defend both." Katzber sneered, stepping forward, slapping the heavy steel pry bar against his palm. "She ain't gonna shoot nobody, boss. She's bluffing. Let me move her." "Take one more step, Katzber," Veronika said softly. She didn't raise the rifle, but her thumb rested casually on the exposed hammer. The terrifying calm in her demeanor made the hulking man hesitate. He had dealt with angry people, screaming people, terrified people. He had never dealt with someone completely devoid of fear. Witold laughed nervously, trying to regain control of the situation. "You're pathetic, Veronika. You think you can stop a $50 million development with an antique rifle and a bad attitude? Gunnel Suchiu signed the condemnation order this morning. As of right now, you don't even own that cabin. You are a squatter on municipal land." Gunnel Suchiu is a terrified little man who signed a piece of paper he has no legal authority to enforce, Veronika replied. "You're out of your depth, Gonzales. You bought leases from the BLM and adjacent landowners, but you didn't check the riparian rights. You didn't check the historical covenants. You bought the roof of the house, but you don't own the foundation." "What the hell are you babbling about?" Witold snapped, shivering in his expensive thin coat as the first flakes of snow began to fall. Before Veronika could answer, the crunch of tires on gravel announced the arrival of another vehicle. A beautifully restored vintage Jeep Wagoneer pulled up behind Veronika. The door opened, and Anselmo Higgins stepped out, carrying a thick leather briefcase. Despite the freezing cold, the old lawyer looked entirely in his element, a predator entering familiar hunting grounds. "She isn't babbling, Mr. Gonzales," Anselmo said loudly, his voice carrying a booming, theatrical quality. She is trying to save you from utter financial ruin, though frankly, I advised her against it." Vitold glared at the old man. "Who the hell are you, her public defender?" "I am Anselmo Higgins, Chief Counsel for the Gradenigo Family Trust." Anselmo smiled, a terrifying expression that showed too many teeth. "And you, Mr. Gonzalez, are currently orchestrating a multi-million-dollar trespass on my client's sovereign land. I suggest you tell your operators to shut off their engines, unless you want their machinery seized as collateral." Vitold looked at Cecilia, who had rolled down the window of the escalade, her face pale. Then he looked back at Veronika, the Winchester, and the old lawyer. The arrogance began to fracture, replaced by a creeping, icy dread that had nothing to do with the falling snow. The emergency town hall meeting was called for 8 o'clock that evening. The small municipal building in Telluride was packed to the rafters with locals, investors, and out-of-town reporters. Vitold Gonzalez and Cecilia Agulo stood at the front of the room, flanked by glossy presentation boards showing the proposed Pinnacle at Black Bear Resort. Gunnar Sutsiu sat at the council desk, sweating profusely, gripping his gavel as if it were a life preserver. "This project," Vitold was saying, projecting his voice over the murmuring crowd, his confidence returning in the warmth of the room, "represents the future of our county. We are bringing high-end tourism, sustainable infrastructure, and jobs. The minor delays we've experienced regarding the blight removal of the Gradenigo property are being handled by the county. Progress cannot be halted by the stubbornness of one irrational individual." The doors at the back of the hall swung open with a heavy thud. The room fell dead silent as Veronika Gradenigo walked down the center aisle. She had traded her duster for a clean, pressed denim shirt and a tailored wool blazer, though she still wore her well-worn leather boots. Beside her walked Anselmo Higgins, clutching a stack of manila folders thick enough to stop a bullet. "We aren't here to halt progress, Mr. Gonzalez," Anselmo announced, his voice echoing off the wood-paneled walls. "We are here to claim ownership of it." Gunnar Sutsiu banged his gavel frantically. "Mr. Higgins, you are out of order. This is a closed presentation for council members and approved investors. I am speaking on behalf of the majority landholder of the Black Bear Ridge sector, Commissioner," Anselmo shot back, approaching the council desk. He slammed the massive stack of folders down onto the oak table. The sound made Gunnar jump. "What is this circus?" Cecilia hissed, stepping forward, her composure cracking. "She owns a half-acre dirt patch. We own the 3,000 surrounding acres." "You own surface leases, Miss Agulo," Anselmo corrected her, turning to face the crowd and the investors in the front row. "Leases that are subordinate to the foundational land patents established in 1892. Allow me to educate you. The Gradenigo family did not just settle that cabin. Veronika's great-grandfather, Matteo Gradenigo, was the original assayer for the silver mines. He bought the master deed to the entire valley during the silver crash of '93. Anselmo pulled a massive, wax-sealed document from the top folder and unfurled it. The paper was ancient, covered in elegant, sweeping calligraphy. "Under the doctrine of severable estates, my client's trust owns the absolute mineral rights beneath your proposed resort. But more importantly..." Anselmo paused for dramatic effect, locking eyes with Vitold, whose face was rapidly draining of blood. "Veronika holds the senior, absolute water rights to the Uncompahgre Aquifer and the San Miguel River tributary that feeds your property. By law, you cannot drill a well, you cannot tap a stream, and you cannot flush a single toilet in your luxury resort without Veronika Gradenigo's explicit, written permission." A collective gasp echoed through the room. The investors in the front row began aggressively whispering to one another, their phones suddenly out, texting frantically. "That's impossible," Vitold stammered, gripping the edge of his presentation board so hard his knuckles turned white. "Our title company did a full search. The county assessor assured us the titles were clear." Anselmo turned a glacial glare onto Gunnul Suciu, who was currently trying to shrink beneath his desk. Commissioner Suciu deliberately suppressed the historical addendums to facilitate a quick sale, a federal crime for which I have already contacted the State Attorney General's office. Veronika stepped forward, looking directly into Witold's panicked eyes. "You came to my home. You insulted my family. You destroyed my garden and threatened my life, Witold. You thought because I didn't flaunt my wealth, I had no power." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a heavy steel padlock, dropping it onto the table with a resounding clank. "This is the lock for the main access gate at the bottom of the county highway. A gate that sits on my private easement. As of midnight tonight, that gate will be locked. Any machinery left on my mountain will be considered abandoned property and seized." Cecilia let out a strangled, horrified gasp. "Our excavators! We have $5 million of leased equipment up there. You can't do this." "I just did," Veronika said softly. She turned her back on them and walked out of the hall, leaving the arrogant developers to face the wrath of their ruined investors and the crushing weight of their own hubris. The fallout was swift, brutal, and absolute. The karma that Veronika unleashed upon Apex Development was like an avalanche in the San Juans, unstoppable and thoroughly destructive. By the following morning, the news of the water rights trap had hit the Denver financial papers. Witold's primary investors, a consortium of ruthless hedge funds, instantly pulled their backing, realizing the project was legally dead in the water. The loans Witold and Cecilia had secured using their personal portfolios as collateral were immediately called in by the banks. Within 48 hours, the county sheriff, now operating under the direct scrutiny of the State Attorney General, arrived at the Black Bear Ridge site. Not to evict Veronika, but to oversee the impounding of Witold's heavy machinery. Because the developers had laid the machines on Veronika's private easement and could not legally remove them without trespassing on her newly enforced borders, the leasing companies sued Apex Development for catastrophic breach of contract. Veronika sat on her porch with a steaming mug of black coffee, watching the chaos unfold below. Caspar Behrens was the first to abandon ship, realizing there was no money left to pay him and facing potential assault charges from Anselmo's meticulously filed police reports. The hulking muscle packed his bags and fled the state, leaving Witold to face the music alone. A week later, Veronika drove her battered F250 past the county courthouse. Gunnul Suciu was being led out in handcuffs by state investigators, his face buried in his chest to hide from the local news cameras. The corruption charges carried a mandatory federal sentence. The valley had finally excised its tumor. The most satisfying moment, however, came a month later. Veronika was in town picking up feed when she saw Cecilia Agullo outside a high-end ski boutique. Cecilia was screaming hysterically into a cell phone, mascara running down her face in jagged black rivers, as a tow truck operator hooked up her pristine white Mercedes G-Wagon for repossession. Her cashmere coat looked suddenly pathetic, a fragile shell hiding a thoroughly bankrupt soul. Witold, Veronika later learned, had filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and was facing multiple civil suits for fraud. Their empire of dirt had crumbled to dust. Veronika returned to her mountain. The silence had returned, deeper and more profound than before. She walked to the edge of the property line, where the bulldozers had torn the earth. With slow, methodical movements, she began planting young ponderosa pine saplings in the scars left by the machinery. She didn't build a mansion. She didn't sell out to a kinder developer. She used a fraction of the trust's vast wealth to secure the land into an unbreakable conservation easement, ensuring that Black Bear Ridge would remain wild, silent, and free for the rest of time. She stood up, wiping the rich red dirt from her calloused hands, and looked out over the sprawling valley that she owned outright. The cabin behind her was still rustic, still weathered, and still perfect. They had mocked her life in the remote cabin, confusing simplicity with weakness. They had learned the hard way that the deepest roots are the hardest to pull, and that true power never needs to shout. Veronika's story is a stark reminder that true wealth isn't flaunted in designer clothes or boastful threats. It resides in quiet strength, deep roots, and the unyielding defense of what is right. In our own lives, we often encounter those who judge our worth by the worn fabric of our circumstances. Yet, karma is a patient accountant, always balancing the ledger in the end. Let us walk with respect for the land and each other, knowing the quietest among us often hold the greatest power. If this tale of Western justice and righteous karma moved your spirit, please like this video, share it with someone who appreciates a powerful story, and subscribe to our channel for more soul-stirring narratives.